welcome to episode 178 of The Route. The Route is a glorified coffee chat and podcast form that takes you from A to B with a new guest every episode. As always, I'm your host, Christopher Nascimento, and let's get started. Before we begin today, as per usual, just a couple things to cover. First, if you haven't already, follow the podcast, subscribe wherever it's available. Check us out there. So I believe we're on 10 to 11 audio platforms. Apple, Google, Spotify, Amazon, all that good stuff. So you're checking us out somewhere else, but you prefer those platforms, feel free to look into us there. And then also, if you prefer video, we're available on YouTube. So you can simply type us as The Route Podcast, but our username on all handles, including these podcast platforms, is The Route Cast. So The Route and then CAST. And that way you can find our different clips, our episodes, and all that good stuff. So in addition to that, as I was saying for YouTube, if you want to see just our short form clips, see who that guest is, where you can maybe learn about them, what you can look into, find us up there. And then all classic social media platforms, Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, TikTok, all that good stuff. The Routecast there as well. You can see whose episodes coming out that week, see their snippets as well, and then tune in. But the one thing I always like to add as well, unlike some maybe other podcasts, we're on LinkedIn too. So just with the conversations we're having, the people that we have on this podcast, that was a great medium to use at the Routecast there. And that way you can connect with myself, the guests, like-minded individuals, and it's a great place to, grow your network, start your network, or even just continue to maintain it and take it further from there. So check us out there. All platforms should be able to find us. And with that, we can now get into today's guest. I'd now like to welcome someone who has a wealth of experience in the defense space and who is now the program manager at Marshall Canada. Charlotte Trakinskas, welcome to The Route. How's it going?
I'm good. Thanks, Chris. How are you?
Not too bad. How did I do for the last name there? I got in
You
my head a
nailed
little
it.
bit.
You got it. No, it was
Perfect.
perfect. Thank you.
Awesome. So with that then, as the name of the podcast says, The Route. Do you mind maybe taking me from where it started and how we got to where we are today?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, first off, thanks so much for having me. I love the podcast. I think it's great. And I think it's really cool that you're reaching out to so many different individuals and going through all these different backgrounds because I think, everybody really does have a different route. And I think it's super interesting to hear about them. So yeah, thanks so much for the invite. And I really appreciate being on. So yeah, I mean, starting from the beginning, I'm actually not from Canada. So I emigrated from England to Canada when I was 12, almost 13. I've been in the southwestern Ontario area ever since. I've grown up in London, Ontario. And when I got here, I went to high school, completed that, and I actually went on to Fanshawe College, which is the local college in town, and completed a business administration diploma there. And I actually got into, you mentioned the defense space, so really my entire career has been in the defense industry. From college, I started at General Dynamics Land Systems Canada, which is also in London, Ontario, at the early young age of 20, and I was there for 18 years, and I'll go through my experience there, but that's really been majority of my career has been at that company, which is a defense contractor that sells light armored vehicles for the Canadian Army is the backbone of their product, but also globally. I mean, it's a huge company from the US, Canada, and then various locations worldwide. So when I started at GD, I started actually out in the production floor, out in manufacturing, and I was in the quality section. So really for me, I spent a few years out there doing auditing, ISO auditing. It was an amazing experience being out on the shop floor and seeing how these things are made from, going from a sheet of metal up to the finished product and working with the union and everybody on the shop floor. It was very, very interesting doing auditing and looking at non-conformances on the shop floor, and that's really how I started out there, is kind of getting that hands-on experience with the team. I think I spent the first 3 years of my career at GD with people wondering if I was going back to school and thinking I was a summer student because I'd started so young. But yeah, it was wonderful. And then after the first 3 years there, I took a bit of a leap and went in a completely different direction, still at GD, into another department, which was contracts, which then I spent the next 6.5 years effectively of my career working on bids and proposals, again in the defense space for aftermarket support, various customers and different contracting mechanisms with the Canadian government, the US government, and all in support of the light armored vehicles. From there, I went into program management, and that was really my first stint as like a project management program function, working on an international customer program that GD had at the time. And that was really working with my first experience, really working with end customers on product delivery, managing the execution of the project with various teams in the organization. And that was really my focus during that time. From there, I actually moved into business development. So that was really my last stint at General Dynamics with the business development side. It was actually really cool for me to be in that section of the company because I got to see the front end. It was everything that they were working on as far as bids and proposals, upcoming activity. You're kind of seeing that upper piece, looking over the entire organization of what's coming in the future and working on the strategy and operations management side of things for everything that was, like I said, going to be coming up. And while in that role, I also got heavily into marketing and advertising. So I was leading some of the campaign plans for the organization, including the one that I'm actually working on now, which I'll get to, but that was for a Canadian Army bid that GD was working on, and along with Marshall. So spent my time in the business development team, was a deputy capture manager when I left the organization, working on, again, one of their international campaigns and opportunities. Working cross-functionally with the entire organization on getting that across the line and customers and being out in the field and really being able to do more of the sales and marketing and business development piece was really my last role, which I have to say was probably one of my most favorite roles at the company. And what that really led to, because I had done the marketing piece, where I am now is Marshall Canada. So I left GD May of this year and moved over to Marshall Canada, who's a partner with General Dynamics on a recent contract award that was announced in May for the Logistics Vehicle Modernization Program for Canada. And really the intent of that entire program is modernizing the Canadian logistics fleet. So that's really my current role now, is the program manager at Marshall Canada for the capability to be able to get that to the Canadian government. So moved on from GD after 18 years with that company, and that's really where I grew and I learned, and I went through all of those experiences with a ton of different departments and areas, and now that's where I'm at with Marshall. So left GD, but still working very closely.
Yeah, no, I appreciate you sharing that so far. And
Yeah,
like as I was telling you before we started, like I take notes throughout it just so I can refer back to things. I already have a couple things, even just in that last point there, that I'd love to dive into.
sure.
But before I do, I like to go back to the beginning. So we'll work our way through it again. And I guess the first question I have, and probably have this for most of the guests, when you were, let's say 15, right? When you moved here from England, I think is what you were mentioning. What did that route look like for you at the beginning? Because I find a lot of times when we speak to people, even like myself, I started in accounting, ended up in marketing, and then you kind of figure out as you go. In your mindset, like what did you initially have planned for yourself when you're younger? Hey, this is the route I want to go down. And I guess I'll start with there.
Yeah, it's such a great question. It's funny because I was thinking about this earlier, and I'm glad that you put it that way, because I didn't know if it was just me, where I'm like, I feel like when I was 15, 16, I didn't know what I wanted to do. I mean, I thought I had an idea, and I always really admired people when I was in high school and going through grade 10, 11, where you're really having to hone down on where do you want to go next, and you're prepping for university or college or your next steps. And I admire people who are like, I want to be a lawyer, I'm going to be a doctor, and they know exactly, and they've got a path. And I think, kudos to you, because I think it's very impressive, and you just know. And for me, it's funny because I think in some ways I kind of talked myself out of what I thought I wanted to do in a way, because I've always loved law and business, and I was convinced I wanted to go through and get a law degree and become a lawyer. Except for then I think my lack of confidence probably at that age was like, do you want to do that? Are you sure? And I just kind of talked myself out of it and was like, maybe go more general and figure it out. And that's why I ended up going more the business administration route, and figuring that out, and then decided, if I wanted to get back into it later. So for me, it's worked out, because I think it's taken me 18 years of more the hands-on experience for me, as opposed to like I've completed part-time schooling like the entire time I've been working, which we can talk through. But it was interesting because I think what I maybe wanted to do when I was a lot younger isn't necessarily what I've discovered I love doing now. So it is interesting how it changes.
That's a good point, like what you just mentioned there, where maybe you had in mind initially. And I
Hmm.
find like I don't know if even myself, I've been thinking about this, or I was talking to someone about this the other day, where as you kind of evolve, let's say, you kind of uncover different things, like, that's not necessarily the best fit for myself, right? Like maybe, sure, I was good with numbers and stuff, and like I could do it. I found I had much more of a creative element to myself, and even like a people person ability. Whereas I found in my accounting job, at least what I was doing at the time, I felt like I was right here. I wasn't working in a team as much. So I find you
Yeah,
kind of start to uncover that. Or even now, I'm in more direct sales. I find I still want to maybe go back to a bit more of that strategic side of things. So I feel like as you kind of progress throughout your career, you kind of uncover things, figure things out about yourself, probably change as well. So things kind of
absolutely.
develop a bit further from there. So I guess that's probably a good way to kind of get into your time at GD. How did that maybe to start? How did that come about? Was it something you were like, hey, after Fanshawe College, it seemed like a great opportunity. Let me just get my first role after school, or how did that kind of unfold from there?
Yeah, actually, it is interesting. I mean, GD is a huge company in London. They employ, I want to say close to 2,000 people. Yeah, it's a large manufacturer in the area, so it's very well known. But for me, when I first moved to Canada, my mom actually worked at GD, so I knew GD, and it was kind of a household name. I got to do the take your kids to work day. Very, very much aware of it. Knew the product and everything else. So it was kind of this grew up wanting to kind of go there because I knew it was great and I knew how much she enjoyed it. So it was definitely somewhere that once I got to the age of being like, okay, I want to get in there and join the workforce and see where it takes me. That was kind of the aim right from the get go.
Yeah, so that probably answers one of the questions I did have because I find even just throughout this podcast, like using initially kind of started more of a sports business one because that's what I wanted to get into, but obviously now I'm much more in all sorts of things because I find there's so many different routes you can kind of uncover. But I never even like going back to the initial start of this podcast. There are so many jobs within sports. Even
Hmm.
I had no idea. I thought if you wanted to work in sports, you could be a coach, an agent, or like a trainer. But as you kind of develop things a bit further, you learn about it. And that was one of the questions I was going to have was, how did you get into the defense like industry? But that kind of explains it a bit further, having a large part in the London community, and then with your mom being there as well. So once you started and got in with GD, was that something that you ever had in mind? Hey, this route, let's say that I'm going
Yeah.
on with GD, this is something that I have the plan to continue with and I want to grow internally, or did you say, hey, let me get this first experience and then kind of decide from there?
Yeah, great question. Well, I think I'll touch on the first part that you said too, because I think, I mean, like I said, my mom worked there and pretty much worked her entire career in Canada there. So there was that element. I think for me growing up, I've always been around military or the defense. So it definitely appealed to me because even growing up in the UK, I mean, where I lived, it was close to an Air Force base. From that side of things, my brother worked at a defense contractor in England. So it's always kind of been around. And then and I've got a lot of family history when it comes to military on like my dad's side and my grandparents. So it's always just kind of been there, and something that I very much respect. And I think when I first got into GD, I knew that was where I wanted to get into because I knew it was a great company and I knew there was a lot of opportunities. It was almost like comforting too because I knew of them from the family side of things. But when I first got in there, and I think because I was so young as well, one of the things initially about GD, but I think it's very similar in a lot of the if you get into defense contracting, there's a general theme there where you see the loyalty as far as the customer and what it is that you're doing it for. And I think that was one of the things that for me when I first started, I was really blown away and moved by, whether it comes to Remembrance Day or the feedback that you get from the end users of the equipment, and it's for protection and that you're, potentially saving people's lives, and what it is that you're actually building it for is pretty moving. And I think having that kind of passion about it makes you really love the product and what it is that you're doing. And for me, that was one of the things that right from the get-go, I loved that side of it and it meant a lot to me. And then it made me want to stay. and continue on within the company, but within the space. And that's kind of why I'm still in the defense space now.
Yeah, no, that makes a ton of sense, and especially when you kind of compare and like contrast that to other spaces that are maybe more like, let's say, the tech side, where it's much more
Sure.
volatile, right? Clients are maybe more so looking the best price, not really as much loyalty, you could possibly say as well. It's kind of different where you can kind of understand those different perspectives, right? Where there's more something to build on together, maybe in the space you're in.
Hmm.
And I guess with that as well, how did you know, let's say, because I find we have all different, I'd say there's like three main segments that we have for like an audience of the route. We have like a younger one that's maybe new professionals, then we have like the 30 to 40 range, and then we have people that are a bit older than that, they're maybe more established in their career. So I'd like to ask questions that kind of touch on all. Thinking of, let's say, these new grads or young professionals that are maybe about to take their first leap after their first role, right? So maybe moving on to their second role after school. How did you decide? Obviously, I know you're touching on that you want to stay within GD, but how did you decide which path or which department or which, a career project or progression you wanted to go down within the company? Was there something that kind of stood out to you, or was the opportunity there and you said, "Hey, let me try that out"?
I think it was a bit of both, honestly, to answer that. So because again, I started so young, I think I was still growing up. I mean, I was still trying to figure out who I was and what I wanted to do. I thankfully, for me, I had the opportunity to do that while within the company, and that was great. It's interesting because it was good because the opportunities were there and it was a bigger company. So I had, the ability to go to different departments because the opportunity was there. There was a lot of things that I think I had that natural drive for certain functions that I liked. Like I'd spoken before about how I enjoyed the legal side of things. So to move from, say, getting into production, like I'm a bit like you, where I think I have both sides of me where I can be very organized and very detailed, and that's when I started in database management and that side of things. But then I've got the terms and conditions legal side, but then it's evolved because I've got this very creative and graphics and marketing side of me as well. So it's a little bit of both, but I think it really was a mix of opportunity was there, but then also as I grew as a person by taking on new experiences, learning what I wanted to do next or try out to see if it was a right fit for me. And I think even as I went, I mean, I tried it out and I might have liked elements of it, but it took kind of getting through different positions or trying new things to then kind of figure out, be like, oh, okay, this one actually fits. Like, I think I figured out what's kind of my gig and what I like doing with a combination of what I'm good at doing. And then what I think will actually kind of, I'll say, fill my cup, but from that perspective. But it was definitely a mix of, and doing schooling at the same time, I think also kind of drove what that direction would be as far as changing of jobs and trying new things because of whether it be, like you said, taking courses and then being like, oh, I actually like this as much as I thought I would. And that kind of changed my perspective on some areas as well.
No, and like that's a great point that you're sharing there. Where obviously I know people listen to the podcast, but I find sometimes when I'm just having these conversations, there's things that just stick with me, and I find what you're just saying there, where you kind of go throughout your career and maybe you have like, let's say, an end goal or maybe what you think would be a great end goal that you'd like to reach, but sometimes to kind of get there or as you kind of progress you just have to try out new roles, and maybe it's a little more uncomfortable, you'd have to do it just to kind of see how that works out, and you probably learn something about that, right? So I think that's a great point that you shared there, because I feel like when you're younger and you're thinking of your career, you never really thought of maybe doing roles that you aren't exactly sure if it's the best fit for you, but it's probably a good opportunity to uncover and see how that falls afterwards. So I think that's a great point. And I guess moving on from there, right? You went into contracts, and then that's where you got into program management.
Hmm.
So do you mind maybe diving into that? Because I know even for myself, as bad as it sounds, I have like people at my current company. I think they have program management, program manager. I have no idea what that means. So what does that entail, and like what kind of things would you do in that, and how did your role evolve from there?
Yeah, absolutely. So for me, the way that I've always kind of viewed that function, you've got your end deliverable to a customer. I mean, when I say project, it could be something that's small or something that's, years in the making, whether it's getting a contract, you're designing something, brand new equipment, then you're moving through working that through the customer, getting it all approved, you're going to go to production and then deliver it at the end. So there's all these milestones and a lot of different tasks and things that need to happen all the way through. So really from a project management, program management perspective, it's really your role, and this is similar to what I'm doing now, is making sure everything's moving along. And really, you're working with a larger team. Like for me now with Marshall, I'm working with engineers, I'm working with finance, supply chain management, and then customers, and then other suppliers. I mean, it's your job is really facilitating and ensuring that the project is moving along at the pace that it needs to, usually within a budget that you need to meet from a company perspective. But for me, it's very much you're facilitating everything that the team needs to be successful. And that's kind of where like a leadership perspective comes into it, because I always looked at it as your job is you've got the customer. Typically, you're the interface with the customer, and then you're working with the rest of the organization for everyone to be successful.
That makes sense. Where it's almost like you're helping. I guess if this makes it, but moving the pack forward, right? Like, hey, are we hitting
Mm-hmm.
our targets? Kind of moving forward from there, ensuring that meets. So that does make sense. And I think you mentioned as well after you kind of evolved from that program management role at GD, you got into business development. And I know you're in the defense space, and I find when you said that, it kind of sparked my curiosity because I'm curious how that works. Because obviously it's a unique space, right? Like you're not just cold calling a bunch of different companies, or maybe you are. I'm not
Yeah.
sure. But how does that work? Because I know there's a bidding process to it. But how do you go about, I don't know if you can say, but like acquiring new customers, or how do you go about growing the business when it's in the defense industry?
Yeah, absolutely. It is a great question because it is unique and different than, say, like you said, you're not just going to go through the phone book and necessarily just cold call a lot of people. But I mean, it is a structured industry because you're working with directly with governments and with the end users, and typically how that process will go. I mean, if they're in need of something, it's a lengthy process typically. But we had, and it's the same with Marshall. We've got business development managers that are out there working with end customers to be like, what do you need? Is there something in the space that we can support on? What's coming up? I mean, Canada will issue out a directive on what it is that they need to support the Army or the Air Force or the Navy from that side of things. And it's really from a contractor perspective, you're looking at those going, okay, how can we help? And where are those? So when you are in business development from that perspective, you're looking at everything that's on the horizon to say, we know this is coming because Canada or the US or whomever has said, this is what we need. And this is what we're looking to procure to be able to support our fleets or um, our soldiers or whoever in the field. But and it's a timing thing as well, right? Because you could get equipment that lasts for a long time, but it could be, due to be replaced or whatever it is. So from a business development perspective, you should be looking at everything that's on the horizon and planning for that and trying to foresee that, and where can the company support those. So really that's the role when it comes to like strategy and business development and working with end users, is seeing how it best fits and what it is that you can support them with. So it's a very structured process as far as because it's government. So everything is structured from that, but that's really how you should be looking at it from the business development perspective.
No, that makes a ton of sense. And kind of using my own experience. So like the other day, I was working on a contract that's kind of related to a government project, and they're saying beyond a certain total, they would then have to go to a bidding process, and essentially the lowest bid would win in this circumstance. How
Okay.
would that work in the defense space? Because obviously you're talking about bidding, but then you also touched on a bit earlier how your role eventually involved more marketing and advertising. Is it looked at an overall perspective, or is it maybe looked at it through my previous deal I was working on, or is the lowest bid? How does that kind of work where you kind of balance the bidding and then the marketing and advertising as well when it's government contracts?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. I think a lot of the marketing that you'd see from government contractors, I mean, it's not necessarily direct marketing like we want to win this campaign for this specific bid, because I think again, it's a rigorous process when it comes to government contracting, because there's a lot that goes into it. It's not as simple as like, here's your price. I mean, there's a lot of things, like from a technical perspective, price sure would come into it. It's, what are you doing for the economy? I mean, there's so many different things that could be taken into account. And like you said, it's, I think from a government perspective, it's looking at all pieces of that. If you're hitting the mark on everything that they're looking for, then that's great. But I think from a marketing perspective, it's not necessarily a direct, we want to win this specific piece. as a company, you're also marketing for bringing people in and engaging talent and recruitment and things that you want to do in the community and that side of things. So you have marketing in the sense of the company out-facing marketing, but then also your internal marketing too for your team and from a leadership perspective. So there's all those different elements, but it's not as simple as like the lowest wins, but there's a lot more to it.
Yeah, that makes sense. Almost more from like a macro perspective, right? Where that marketing could kind of lead into that overall play that you're talking about when, contracts are looked at, right? So that makes sense. And
Mhm.
then one of the things that you mentioned throughout your route that kind of really stood out to me was obviously you're at GD for 18 years, right? So I'm sure you're comfortable there. It was great. Developed a lot of relationships. How is that in regards to like understanding it's a good opportunity to maybe move over to Marshall now? Because I'm assuming, like from my perspective now, as I meet with people more and more, it seems like people aren't staying at companies as long. But then when they do make that shift, it's obviously a change, right? And change is always kind of uncomfortable. It's something that, you know, is going to push your boundaries a bit further and keep challenging yourself. How did you go about that? Because obviously, I'm sure that would be a big change in regards to your career.
It's Chris, I'll be honest with you, it was terrifying. It was absolutely terrifying. So and I'm really glad you asked because it's obviously something that I've gone through. I mean, this was 6 months ago. Probably one of the biggest decisions I've ever had to make personally. It was, yeah, I mean, it was terrifying, but it was a transition. And it's funny because to go back on what we were saying about growth with people and change and not knowing who you were, if I went back to 20-year-old me and said, this is kind of the process you're going to go through and this is going to be your route and this is how you're going to feel about it and these are the things you're going to do, I'd have been like, absolutely not. There would be no way. I'm not the same person I was when I was 20 or 30. I've grown so much and the things that I enjoy doing now, and the risks that I would take and the opportunities I would take. I mean, even doing this podcast, for example, if I went back to 20 something year old me, it would be like, no, never going to happen. I wouldn't dream of doing it just because whether it be confidence or nerves or whatever it is. But um, it is interesting because again, if I'd gone back to 20 something year old me and said, you're going to have 18 years at GD and then you're going to decide that you're going to move on to another company, I would have probably not believed you. But it was an interesting transition for me because again, I knew Marshall from doing the marketing side of things and working with the team on the bid with Canada for the contract that was awarded in May of this year. So I knew of the company. I knew some folks that already worked there. And it was one of those situations where the opportunity came up and I had to sit back and question, like, do I go for it? And I'd never really thought about doing anything like that because, like you said, I'd been there for a long time. I was comfortable. I knew the company. I knew the people. Um, and I would have kept going, but it was just one of those where I was like, I think I need to put myself outside of my comfort zone. And it's a growth opportunity. It's a great opportunity. Still being connected with GD, which was nice from a personal level, but it was a big leap and it was definitely an interesting one. I'm definitely glad I've done it, but it was scary and it was going through the learning curve of new company, new people, new processes, new way of doing things, but scary and exciting all at the same time. But it was definitely a process to have to go through the pros and the cons and what I wanted to do. I mean, I was fortunate. I didn't leave GD in any kind of there's no bad blood. We still work incredibly well together. I mean, I loved working there, but it was a hard decision. It was definitely a big leap for me.
Yeah, and that's a great point that you're mentioning. Just kind of looking back, like if you were to compare, let's say, against your younger self and saying what you would end up doing, like even this podcast, as you mentioned, I
Hmm.
think that's a great point because I feel like a lot of guests say that. And to be honest, even from my own perspective, someone's like, "Hey, I listen to the podcast. I don't want to hear it because I hate being on camera, but I think it's such a great experience and it challenges you." I'm assuming that opportunity did the same for you. And was that something where you kind of touched on it there as well? But when you're working on this bid with Marshall and it kind of came up afterwards, was that something where your relationships that you developed through working with that team gave you a little more, I don't know, what would say, confidence or even the opportunity? Like that's how it came about, where they said, "Hey, we had such a great, experience working with you. We'd love if you kind of, came and helped us further." How did that opportunity came about?
Yeah, no, it's a great point because I mean, it's one of those things like having the close connections definitely made me aware of, that I knew opportunities would be coming, but I think it was one of those, I think when I saw it, because I did the same as everybody else, I posted and I had to interview and I applied and I went through that whole process, which again was new for me, especially with a company outside of GD and being there for so long. I mean, it came up from that because I saw it because I had the connections and I saw the postings for it go up and that side of things. So I think it definitely helped when it came to going through the interview process and having the experience and understanding of what the program was and what needed to happen to it. But that was kind of the process of how that went. But I think, yeah, I mean, relationships for me are huge, and the job side of things, that aside, I mean, it's something that I think in general is something that I pride myself on, is maintaining and having strong relationships with people, and not necessarily again for the career movement element, but just I had it at GD and I've had it with customers and external other relationships with suppliers and that side of things. Like it's such a big piece of anything that you're doing, whether it's new job, existing job, moving within a company, everything, the foundation is on relationships.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense, and it's funny. Like I think I said something earlier about like just doing over 178 episodes. There's a couple of themes that kind of stand out, and I find the relationship point like probably 99.9% of the episodes, like everyone kind of touches on the relationships and being such a great thing and how monumental it is. And I guess throughout that as well, you kind of touched on it all, but maybe one of the last questions I can ask before I kind of get to my two wrap up questions, you might maybe sharing a bit more about your current role, right? So you're at Marshall now, you left from GD. What does that current role as program manager there look like? And what kind of things are you doing on a day to day if someone was to drop in on you and follow you and shadow you for the day?
Yeah, no, it's very similar to what I was mentioning with the project management side of things. So we have a contract that we're executing. It's very interesting with this one because we have a lot of partners that we're working with, GD being one of them. So it's a lot of engaging with partners. Again, there's so much to the program and project management side of things. So I spend my entire day working with people where it comes to the relationship side of things. And that's where I think even for me going through my career, that's where I've really decided that that's what I like doing. When I said earlier about how it took me getting through some jobs and I gained experience being able to look at the bigger picture and understanding the full, I'll say, spectrum of an organization and understanding all of the different areas has benefited me hugely. But then I've kind of now found my niche areas where I'm like, this is what I like. Like I enjoy relationships. I enjoy engaging with customers. Again, not the same person I was when I was 20 because I would have a different answer. But it's interesting how I've evolved to doing that now because that's really what I enjoy. And that's really what I'm doing at Marshall now with the program manager position. I'm interfacing with the customer, with our partners, and then on a day-to-day basis, it's working with my entire cross-functional team to ensure that I'm facilitating everything that they need to be successful on the daily, but then also for the end big picture. So whether that's, you know, leading teams and it's more the people side of things and being a good people leader, but it's helping with any issues, or I'm, might put on my contracts hat depending on the day, or a supply chain hat depending on the day, working engineering questions through with the team. So you're really looking at the full spectrum of everything. And that's really like every single day. That's kind of what you're doing. And it's what's coming up next, what meetings are next, what external due dates do we have to hit, that side of things. So it's, yeah,
No, no, that's
all the
great.
areas.
No, no, I think throughout the whole podcast, you've done a great job of explaining it all. So I do appreciate that. And we've kind of touched on it. And even like just now, you're saying, going back to your 20-year-old self, right? And I
Hmm.
have this question I've asked it 178 times, and I think it's a great way to kind of end the episode. But if you were to go back in time, right? You're 20 years old. You're having the opportunity to go speak to a younger version of yourself. What is like one piece of advice that you think you've learned throughout your career so far that would be like monumental to know at 20 years old?
Oh gosh, such a good question. I would say, and I would say this to any person getting to any, and it's any kind of industry, because I think it's more related to people, not the defense space or anything specific. But biggest advice that I could give would be to take chances. And I know that's probably easier said than done. But I think it's, my previous version of myself was pretty, I'd say more on the shy side, quite nervous, absolutely hated public speaking. Like I would avoid it at any cost possible. And it's, for me, these are things like throughout my career, I've been given opportunities. I've had some great advice from people, and it's really, enabled me to grow, to be comfortable with those things, but I had to be uncomfortable to get comfortable. So I think that the biggest thing that I would say to myself and to other people would be, always say yes to opportunities. It's an opportunity, whether you end up liking it or not, but at least you tried and then you figured it out, and then you move on, you learn from it and you grow. And maybe you'll find something that you absolutely love that you didn't know that you would love. And I think that's the big thing, because you don't know. You're always growing. We're maturing, we're growing, we're learning. That's the whole point of life and career development, right? You don't want to kind of hone in on one thing and then not be open to new opportunities. So I think for me, it would be take risk, say yes, do the things that make you uncomfortable, and use it as like your learning process to gain confidence is the big thing.
That's perfect. Exactly why I like to end the podcast with that. And I did mess up. I usually have another question I asked prior, but I messed the two up, which is fine. But they kind of go in unison together. So we went back, in time and looked at, a
Yeah.
younger version of yourself. But if we were now go into the future, I like to say I'm going to live until 103 on a rocking chair. Think about like all the good times that I've had throughout my career. What's maybe like one story that if you're on a rocking chair at 103, or one thing that if you were to tell like your current self, they'd be like, hey, like this is crazy. I can't believe this took place to my career to date so far. What is that one story that you think at 103 you'd remember, kind of stand out to you throughout your career so far?
Yeah, that's a great one too. It's funny because I think I've done some pretty cool things. Like I've had opportunities to do some pretty cool things in my job, and whether it be customer interactions or demonstrations of equipment and that side of things. And I mean, those stand out as physical things that have happened where I'm like, I love this. Like that's really, and it's made me figure out what I love doing. But there is one defining moment, and it kind of ties into what I was saying about the confidence and opportunities, where I'll always remember one moment in my career where it was a shift of not having a ton of confidence and not necessarily knowing where I fit. And I think it was maybe because I was young and I just needed the experience, but I was sitting on a plane and we're about to take off, and I was going to an international destination for work. And I had this moment of, and I'll never forget it, because I had this moment of sitting there being like, they're sending me to do this because I'm good at my job and I'm the right person to go and do this. And it was just one of those like distinct moments in life where I was like, that's pretty cool. And I think it was defining for me, because it was this switch of, you're about to do something that you think is really cool and you're excited about, but like people trust you to do this and they've got the confidence in you to do this, so you have the confidence in yourself to do this. And it was so minor, but it was something that was so big for me that it's stuck ever since. And it's just, yeah, it's an odd defining small moment, but it really had an impact, because I think it was just more a moment where I was like, oh, maybe I'm pretty good at this. And I think that's just kind of where it hit, and it changed more so my perception on myself, I think, was the big piece. So as much as it sounds so simple, but I think those kind of moments in life are pretty cool when it comes to your career too, where you just have those, especially going from somebody who was a lot younger and not necessarily the most confident or outgoing person, where I've taken that and tried to grow from it. So very similar to the, advice that I would tell my 20-year-old self. That's one of those moments that sticks out.
No, I appreciate you sharing that. That's kind of the cool thing about doing these podcasts. I find as people kind of go throughout, it's like these small moments that build up to what's happening now, or like how things have played out. And like even using like my own experience, I find there's like these small things where you just click, right? Maybe similar
Yeah.
to you sitting on that plane, where like, oh, like this is how it's gonna go for the next X amount of period, right? To go from there. So that's pretty cool, and exactly why I like to wrap up the podcast with those two questions, because I find it just brings it all together, wraps it up beautifully. And yeah, unless there's anything else you'd have to share, Charlotte, thank you so much for coming on it. It's been great.
No, it was great. I mean, I really, like I said at the beginning, I appreciate the opportunity. And I think I appreciate that you have, like you said, you've got different demographics that will listen into the podcast and kind of all have a different reason for listening, and whether it's relating to career elements or you're starting out, that kind of thing. But I think you'd ask me about the advice for 20-year-old me, and I think the only thing that I would add, and it was the best advice I've ever had. So for anybody that's listening to it, that's maybe starting out in their career, I think I had gone through this, who do I want to be moment in my career. And it was when I was in my program role at GD. And I think there's a lot of pressure, and I'm sure it's for everybody in the workforce. And I think as a woman in the defense space, because it is typically and has been historically a very male dominated industry. So it was interesting because I was trying to find where I fit in my role as a woman in the industry and whether I had to kind of change who I am. And I mean, I'm always this way. Like I like to think I'm a pretty nice person, and that's kind of my motto in life is just, I don't know, just be nice to people. Like it's not really that hard. So that's kind of how I'm always at. Like it's always about approach and delivery when you're working with people, and relationships are huge. But the advice I got was, don't change who you are. Just be you. And it was the most simple advice, but it was huge. And so again, one of those impactful moments where it just happened where I was like, I don't need to be tougher or more direct or whatever. Like if it's working for me, which it is, and my career's progressed from there, and I just haven't changed how I am. It was one of those, solidifying moments that when that person said it to me, I was like, you know what? Okay, I like that. Like that's just, I'm going to be me. And if I was pretending to be something I'm not in order to advance in my career or, be seen a different way or whatever, then it's not the right thing for me and I'll find something else. But I like the stay true to yourself and just be you.
Yeah, no, I think that's perfect. And to be honest, that's something else. Like I think throughout the podcast, people have always said you'd be surprised how far being nice goes,
Yeah,
right? Because
it's
they're like,
huge.
there's a lot of shitty people out there, so you'd be surprised just by being nice, like how far that goes. So I think that's perfectly put. And yeah, thank you so much for coming on, and really cool to kind of dive into your own. This is exactly why I want to shift away from sports business, kind of do like every single thing because it uncovers so much more than just talking about people and similar type. So I really appreciate you coming on.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much.
All right, well that's it for this week's episode. Stay tuned for the next one.